So this is a situation that I want to talk about. Theresa May, the Prime Minister now of the United Kingdom, gave a speech in the House of Commons a few days ago about schools and changes in policies for new schools. And the bit that caught the headlines was the bit about grammar schools and the fact that she was going to allow new grammar schools. That was the proposal, new grammar schools to be built. And that hasn't been allowed to happen now for about 20 years, something like that. If you're not aware of what a grammar school is in the UK, a grammar school is a school that selects pupils based on their academic ability, or at least that's the way that it's supposed to function, usually at the age of 11. So what you have is an academic institution that is selecting pupils based on their academic ability, and some people have problems with that because they say it discriminates against the poorer pupils. We could discuss about the rights and wrongs and that, and what would be gauging it against. Is it better to have a system now where if you live in a catchment area of a school that has a pretty poor outlook, if you've got the cash to move to a better catchment area for a better comprehensive school, you do so. But if you're not rich enough to move house, go to the desperate measure of moving house, you're just stuck with the school that you're at 9 times out of 10 because the better schools are all oversubscribed. So that's a conversation in itself. But the bit that I want to talk about is the bit that's always really stuck in my craw, which is the business of faith schools. Because at the same time, she mentioned that she's going to remove the requirement for new faith schools, that 50% of the pupils that they take in don't have to fulfill the religious requirements of the school. And this has been seen as a much lesser issue, certainly in terms of the press, which is a little bit surprising considering that in the United Kingdom there are at present only 163 grammar schools, only 163 schools, academic establishments that discriminate on the grounds of academic ability, whilst there are 7,000 faith schools, there are 7,000 schools already that discriminate, that are academic establishments that discriminate on the grounds of the religion of either the pupil, or if it is a school that's taking in younger pupils, often the religious convictions of the parents. And what an absurdity it is of faith school, is it not really? I mean, let's be honest, I'm not going to stand here and say that your faith, if you have a faith position, is a load of old rubbish, but what we do know, right, what has to be true is that at least all but one faith positions are a load of old rubbish. And so what a tenuous grounds that is to base your school upon and to insist upon that as a criteria. And we do not allow any other similar criteria. We don't have left-wing schools and right-wing schools, communist schools, socialist schools, capitalist schools, fascist schools, or anything along those lines. We don't allow astrology schools, we don't allow homeopathy schools. How absurd would it be if we allowed schools that only accepted pupils if the pupils and the pupils' parents believed that people genuinely are abducted by aliens? And yet, how is a faith school on an intellectual level any less absurd as a concept than an abducted by aliens school? I can't really drive a cigarette paper between those two ideas. And the thing that I really object to with regard to faith schools is it goes against the entire grain of the ethos of modern society, which is to be anti-discrimination, or at least anti-discrimination where that discrimination is not relevant to what is involved. Let me read you what Wikipedia has to say about the Equality Act 2010. As an integral part of UK labour law, it is unlawful to discriminate against a person because they have one of the protected characteristics, which are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, and that includes lack of religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So religion or lack of religion is normally regarded as a protected characteristic. Now, obviously, this Equality Act 2010 doesn't mean that if you're employing somebody or if you're taking people onto a course that you have to act indiscriminately, that you just put all the names in a tombola and draw them out. We allow discrimination, but that discrimination is expected to be on relevant grounds with relevant criteria. And if you want to discriminate boys and girls on the grounds of one of those protected criteria, you better have damn good grounds to do so. and it needs to be within this legislation as part of one of the exclusions to do so. Now, this legislation actually applies to schools. Section 6 applies to schools within this legislation, and the only reason that these schools of a special religious character, these faith schools, are allowed to still exist is because there's a sop to the major religions of the country, and for no justifiable reason other than that, because there's no sensible reason to have these schools, an exclusion was put in to allow schools that have a special religious character to discriminate on the grounds of the religion of the child or the child's parents, and that is the only way that that is allowed to take place. Now, I think even the most objectionable of the political classes in this country realises that there's something a little bit grotesque about that. And so what was put in place was this measure that if you was to start a new faith school, we're not going to stop people starting new faith schools because it's a little bit too much of a hot potato. You know how things work in society. We always do the right thing unless there's just too many people out there who want to do the wrong thing, and then we give it a little bit of a free pass. Well, there's too many people that want to continue doing the wrong thing here and allowing this form of egregious discrimination. So what was put in place is this measure whereby you can have a new faith school, you can still crack on discriminating against people who aren't religious in this way, but 50% of the places within your school cannot be discriminatory places. So you're only allowed to be prejudiced effectively if you're starting a new faith school or faith academy 50% of the time. And the problem with that is that the Catholic Church, who would quite like to build a whole load of new schools and indoctrinate and brainwash a new generation of Catholics, aren't really happy with that. They want it to be 100%. They want to be able to make sure that 100% of kids that come to their schools are Catholics or have Catholic parents, right? And so they weren't prepared to build new schools, and that is why Theresa May has buckled in this situation. And this is the situation that we have as things stand. In terms of state-funded schools, there are 7,000 state-funded faith schools in England. That is 1 in 3 schools in England are faith schools, almost entirely Christian schools. And let me throw a few other little bits into the mix here. A lot of these state-funded faith schools are what we call academy trusts now. And what that means is they started off as state-funded schools in the local education authorities under the auspices of the local education authorities. And then when this whole academy trust system came out, they wanted to change to academy trust, because in academy trust you still get the state funding, but it allows you a little bit more freedom for the school to push its own agenda. And if you're a faith school, that means your religious agenda, you can push that a little bit harder and deviate a little bit more from the curriculum that the local education authority would insist upon. So they moved to the academy trust model. Now, somebody decided a few years ago to try to put an application in for a decidedly non-religious academy trust, rather than just a secular academy trust or a faith academy trust. No, let's go for a decidedly non-religious one that is going to discriminate. Rather than discriminating against the non-religious in terms of applicants, it'll discriminate against the religious and say that the tone of the voice is to promote the lack of religion and irreligiosity. And the government knocked that back out of hand and said, not only will we not allow that application, but frankly we find that rather offensive to religious people. So there you go. It's not only fine and dandy, but it's been promoted and now accelerated, this idea of a school that discriminates against the non-religious. But the idea of the opposite is just so offensive to even consider that they just dismiss it out of hand. Then bear in mind those statistics, the one that I gave you, which is that that's 1/3 of state-funded schools are faith schools, discriminating against those that are not religious. And the vast, vast majority, 99% of those, are Christian schools, okay? Bear that in mind. They're either Church of England schools or Catholic schools. And then bear in mind the statistics with regard to how religious people are in the United Kingdom. I cannot give you the statistics for school kids, but what I can give you the statistics from the British Social Attitude Survey, from which we know that looking at cohorts, we know that every new generation is less religious than the one before. And the 18 to 25-year-olds, 65% of them, about 2/3 of them, had no religion whatsoever. So we have this situation then where let's just assume that a third of children, school-age children, are religious then, and let's just assume that they're Christians, that a third of school-age children are able to choose freely and without being discriminated against in regard their religious beliefs between any of the state-funded schools out there, while the other two-thirds, the majority of school-age children, are effectively barred from going to a third of the schools out there. Now, there was this SOP at the moment, which is that 50% of places for new faith schools had to be kept available still for those children. That criteria is going to be removed. So effectively, a third of schools can now discriminate entirely against two-thirds of children. And this is a really big deal. If you're living in a town that has very few schools, and maybe some of those schools aren't really very good, and the best school happens to be a faith school, well, then you've shit it unless your parents are Christians, or unless you're a Christian. But if you're a Christian and your parents are Christian, then you can go to those schools. And that's putting a really skewed perspective on what people claim to believe and on the driving and motivation forces behind the faith that people actually have. And how can that be a reasonable criteria? I mean, what would you think would be the most relevant criteria for selecting for an academic institution? Academic ability, such as a grammar school does, or on the grounds of the religion that the individual and the parents have, which is what a faith school has. And yet in England there are 163 grammar schools, 7,000 faith schools, and yet when Theresa May talks about taking the handbrakes off these two things, the media, the interest of the media is on the grammar schools and not the faith schools. You've got to build almost 7,000 new grammar schools before grammar schools could become as big of a problem as faith schools are at the present. And yet faith schools, not only have they been getting a continued pass, but now the situation has been exacerbated. And I just think that is a truly, truly terrible and deplorable situation that we're finding ourselves in, simply as a SOP to certain religious pressure groups. So let me just sum up with this. I suppose I need to say a little bit about the grammar schools since I've mentioned them in this video. It might class as an aside to some people, but I know people will ask me about this. What is my position? I have mixed feelings. I come from Lincolnshire, one of only, I think, 3 counties in the United Kingdom that has kept grammar schools. And I don't see them quite in the sort of terrible, nefarious way that some other people see them. In the past, we had a system in the United Kingdom, which I think a lot of people are minded of. We had GCEs and CSEs, and if you went to grammar school, you did GCEs, which were a higher level of qualification. If you went to a secondary modern school, you were then locked into doing CSEs. You never had the chance to excel a little bit later on in your education. You were locked in effectively to lower socio-economic aspirations. And then we moved to this GCSEs, which was a combined exam that covered the whole spectrum of people, and that is the model that we have now. And so whether you're going to go to a comprehensive school or a grammar school, you will still be doing the same kinds of exams, and you will still have a chance to excel in those exams. So effectively, grammar schools will function as, at the moment, the better comprehensive. Usually the out-of-town comprehensives function, which is that they tend to attract slightly more academically gifted pupils, generally from slightly higher socioeconomic grades. But this is the difference before you want to start criticising grammar schools, is you've got to compare it to how things are, not as how you'd like things to be. And at the moment, if you are the pupil of a more academically gifted child, or any child in a poorer environment, the only way that you can get them to those better schools, because they are oversubscribed, is if you can afford to fork out and move to those areas which are within the catchment of those better schools. That's the only way that you can get in those schools, because they are oversubscribed. At least with a grammar school, if a grammar school functions as it should take pupils from the poorer areas and the richer areas based on their academic merit more and less on where those pupils live. So it should actually function better than the present system. The present system, where in most counties, not in my county, but in most counties, what happens is that you effectively, all the schools are comprehensive schools, but those comprehensive schools that are in better off areas out of town areas. They may not be de jure grammar schools, but they are de facto grammar schools. But the only way that you can get into them is if you can afford to live in those areas. In many ways, I find that a worse idea than the idea of grammar school. So that's where I stand on that. But what I find really objectionable with regard to the way that people view these faith schools is that of the two main objections to faith schools, one is that they're a bit divisive and that it's not getting people from diverse cultures to mingle, and this will only make it worse if you can discriminate 100%, of course, for any new faith school or new faith academy. But the other objection is that they suffer in the same way that grammar schools suffer, which is when you look at the statistics, they tend to have a slightly different socioeconomic balance to other schools. They tend to perform better academically, but they tend to have more middle and upper working class pupils than the average comprehensive school. And that is the objection people have, this suspicion that perhaps these faith schools may be secretly discriminating on socioeconomic grounds. And how objectionable that would be if they were discriminating on socioeconomic grounds, and yet seemingly these same people don't give a crap that these schools are openly discriminating against people that don't have a religion or don't have the right religion to get into that school. And in some ways I find that that attitude of people in giving that a free pass even more objectionable than I do to the fact that the schools try and pull off that shitty stunt in the first place. Well, look, one of the reasons Theresa May has given, the Prime Minister has given of being on board with this, is that she grew up in a religious environment. Her parents are religious, she's religious, and she says that's one of the things that shaped her and made her the person that she is, and that's why she regards that as a reasonable criteria upon which to discriminate against whether or not you're going to let a child into a school. I'm just happy that she isn't one of these people that believes the world is run by shape-shifting fucking aliens, otherwise presumably that would have shaped the person that she is, and she'd regard that particular belief as justifiable grounds upon which to discriminate against whether a pupil is able to attend a school. I think I've made my feelings known with this. I know that I will get some responses that say, well, look, people pay their taxes. They ought to be able to choose the character of the state-funded school that they send their children to. All I would say to you is, if that is the case, then why are these schools only allowed to discriminate against on the grounds of religion, and what about on any other grounds? Maybe you believe that children are better off having a mother and a father, so why aren't schools allowed to discriminate against single parents? If you're a child with only one parent, you run along to another school, Johnny, because you're probably not going to be good enough for our school. Why aren't these schools allowed to discriminate against pupils on these other grounds? I cannot see anything that differentiates religion against these other things, other than the fact that religions are well established and they are very, very strong pressure groups that allow them to keep getting away with this shit. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say on that. I think I've probably made my feelings known, and I hope there's not been too much fence sitting on this particular video. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.